All right, everybody. So let's get started here. First of all, welcome. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today. My name is Dylan, and I'm the software and video educator here at ON1. I'm actually joined by Mo. Mo, do you want to say a word or two so we can know your audio is working?
Yeah, I'll be here answering questions throughout the webinar. So if you guys have anything you want Dylan to show again or any questions that pop up, feel free to use that Q&A module throughout the entire time.
Awesome. Thanks, Mo. Yeah, like Mo was saying, if you do have any questions, feel free to hit up the Q&A module and he'll get to as many as he can. If it's pertinent to what I'm doing, he can stop me and we can kind of go over it live. The webinar is also being recorded. So if you do need to miss out on anything or you need to leave halfway through, no worries. We'll have it up on our blog and our YouTube and our Facebook. So you can always just catch up later. A little bit about the webinar. We're going to be going over landscapes today instead of ON1 Photo RAW. To begin with, we're going to start out kind of going over how to organize a little bit better. I'm not going to spend too much time inside of Browse showing you how to organize. I'm kind of just going to give you guys a few easy ways that you can rate your photos. If you are looking to learn more about organizing and culling your photos, there's an awesome webinar next week that Mo is hosting about getting started, and he'll go over a lot more about how to organize your photos better in Browse. And then after we dive into a little bit inside of Browse, we're going to go and take some photos inside of Develop and kind of go over how to set the basic tonality and kind of set your color points for your shots. As you can see on my screen here, I kind of just grabbed an array of kind of underexposed or overexposed photos, just kind of different shots. There's also a couple photos that we can do some retouching in. I know a lot of landscapes need some retouching, especially if you're at a beach that's crowded or you're at a place that has a lot of people. And then we'll go over a couple different ways that you can use local adjustments to paint light or paint detail or really kind of selectively edit your photos. And then we'll go over a little bit about how to use masking inside of landscapes. And then lastly, well, not really lastly, but another component inside the webinar is we're going to be going over how to add and apply different filters and effects to your photos. And I'll give you guys some tips on my favorite filters that I like to add onto landscape shots. So first of all, we're inside of Browse, and this is basically where we're just going to be browsing for our photos. And so I have these shots here, and a quick way that I like to organize my landscape photos, because I kind of shoot a different, I like to shoot kind of all different mediums of photography, from real estate to landscape to portrait. And so basically, if you look on your left side of ON1 Photo RAW, you have these different panes over here. And so what I like to do after I have my photos, after I've found my photos, is I'll just add a different album. So I can add an album, and I can just add, a landscape album, or any different album I want to, and then I can just grab a photo and I can just drag it into here and drag and drop. And then once I open up Photo RAW again, I can simply click on that. Like for example, I have my masking and brushing here for a masking and brushing webinar I did. And now I can just go back to my landscapes and I'll have my selected landscapes. So this is good for if you want to maybe create an album for like Instagram or social media that you can always drag your favorites into, because then you can go back and you can find those later and you can just export and you're good to go. So a quick way to organize your landscapes. I'm not incredibly huge on organizing my landscapes. I know a lot of people are, but just to give you guys an idea of how to, is you can either, you'll notice that if you hover above a photo here, it'll have these 5 stars and then a box and then a heart and an X. If you're completely unfamiliar with ON1 Photo RAW, these are just ratings that you can use to rate your photos. And actually, I have a poll real quick here. I'm actually going to start a poll, and this will give me a better idea of what you guys, what your experience is with ON1 Photo RAW. So I just started that poll. Feel free to answer those questions, and I'll just continue on here. So basically, if you want to rate your photo, you can either click on these stars. So if I wanted to rate it a 5-star, I could simply click 5 stars, and it'll rate that photo a 5-star photo. You can either do that, or you could just simply hit 5 on your keyboard, and it'll rate your photo for you. A quick way, if you want to rate photos and you want to auto advance to the next one, which you'll see if I click or if I hit 5 on my keyboard, it'll auto advance to the next photo. That's just selected up here in photo and auto advance. So if you don't want that to happen, you can just unclick that. And now if you set a rating, so if I set this rating for 3, it won't advance to my next photo. I like to keep it on just because when I'm rating stuff, I usually do want to advance to the next photo. So Another nifty way besides just using the 1 through 5 keys is you can actually go in here and you can use different color ratings. I know a ton of landscape people use these for, they'll do like red for mountains and like yellow for oceans and green for foliage or whatever it may be. Landscape photographers are usually really organized when it comes to their photos. Since I shoot a whole different, a bunch of mediums of photography, I'm not really in tune with the whole organizing for landscapes. But if you are, a great way to organize is just to simply, rather than clicking on this box and scrolling to the number, just think about it in terms of numbers, because if you just hit 6 or 7 on your keyboard, it'll rate it for you, and then you don't have to click this box and go down here and find which color you want to rate your photo. Another great way you could rate it is just simply like or dislike. So if you have a bunch of landscapes and they're all kind of similar, you kind of shot a bunch of them at the same time, you can just click, like or dislike, or you could just click P and it'll like the photo for you. And then you have all of these photos rated, so you know which ones you like and dislike. And also, if you do rate these photos, so I'll just go through here and rate these real quick. I'll just do like a 1 or a 2, 3 is fine. Do 5, 4, 2, 4, 4. And then so I say I have all of these rated, you'll notice that all of these have ratings. Well, if I go down here to my sort menu and I can go up to rating, and then I can click, I can click descending, and that'll put all of the 5-star ratings at the top and then all of my lower star ratings at the bottom. So if you do that and you have a bunch of different landscapes, you can easily just organize those so that you have all of the ones that you like that are 5-star rated at the top, and you can simply click those. You can export them, head into develop, whatever it may be, just so you do keep track of your landscapes better. Is there any questions right now, Mo?
No questions right now. You're doing great. Keep them on going.
Awesome. Okay, so looking at the poll, about 5% of you said browse. So we're gonna get out of browse because I know it's probably pretty basic for you guys. And we'll start with just heading into develop. So once you've found your photo, you can just simply head into develop here. And now we can start editing our photo. This is kind of an underexposed photo, but I didn't want to blow out any of the lights up here. And generally when I'm shooting long exposure, trying to get like astrophotography, I generally want it to be a little darker, especially using ON1 Photo RAW, because you can easily bump up the shadows, and the shadow slider in Photo RAW is just beyond words. So you'll see this photo here, and really all we need to do to this shot is kind of pull up a little of those darker tones in our photo. So if you have a photo like this and it's a little bit dark and you're like, what do I need to do to kind of boost this photo up a little bit? I would either head to these 2 sliders here, either your midtones or your shadows, because those are kind of the tones in our photo that are a little bit dark and a little bit lacking. So if you just head over to your shadow slider, you could just pull up your shadows, and you'll notice right away that it's already bringing in a bunch of light and a bunch of those shadow tones back into our shot. So once you've kind of pulled up on those shadow tones, it's going to make your photo a little bit flat, because all you're doing is pulling up the darker shadowy tones in your shot. So since we don't need to mess with exposure and we kind of just pulled up on our shadows, a great way to bring life back into your photo is just simply go up to your contrast slider, which the contrast slider is just kind of going to bring in more contrast by kind of adding in some darker tones into the micro contrast into your photo. So to show you what I mean, if I pull up on the contrast, it's going to darken the shot because it's going to bring more contrast, more dark tones into your shot. So what I like to do whenever I have a photo like this is I'll mess with the shadows first and then the contrast to get where I want the contrast to be. And then I'll head down to my midtones here and I'll pull that up a little bit. And the midtones are going to pull out the midtones in your shot, which are going to be kind of the area up here by the mountain and down in the water here. The areas that aren't incredibly dark or incredibly bright are your midtones. So now that we kind of have a basic tonality set, if I hit the \K on my keyboard, in 3 sliders, we've already gave this photo a lot of life. Well, there's a ton more we can do to this shot. And the first thing I want to do is I'm going to actually just heat up the photo a little bit. There's kind of this blue cast around it, and I don't want to heat it up a ton. I just kind of want to give it a little bit more of a heated up look, just to bring a little bit more color back into this cloud here. So I'm just going to pull up on the temperature a little bit. That's a little too strong, probably right about there. And now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, you know, we have like a basic tonality and we have a basic color point set for our shot. Now what we can do is, usually with all landscapes or most landscapes, you're gonna wanna crop, especially if you're shooting with a wide angle lens. If you're shooting raw, you should be able to crop a photo pretty easily without getting any distortion or any noise. This photo, I think I shot it with, I can't remember what body I shot it with, but there seems to be a lot of grain in here within the darker areas, so don't mind that. All I'm gonna do is just click on crop. And for those of you that aren't familiar with these lines inside of the crop tool, these are the rule of thirds lines. And so basically the rule is that if you set your subject or a point of interest in your photo on the intersecting points of these lines, it's gonna make it more interesting. So if you're ever kind of confused on how you need to crop a photo or what your crop should be, you can always just use these lines as your guide. I wouldn't recommend every time, you know, putting your subject on the intersecting points of these lines, because the rules are meant to be broken and you don't need to do that to make an interesting photo. But if you are kind of confused and you're like, wow, I need to crop this photo, but I don't know how to crop it, you can definitely use those these little points as kind of your guide. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna hold down my shift key and I'm just gonna pull back on this crop, and then I'll just pull it up. And like I said earlier, I'm just gonna set, you know, our subjects kind of on the intersecting points of these lines here. So I have the reflection down here, and then I have my mountain on the line. So if I hit enter, I have a nicely cropped photo that has my subject on the intersecting lines of the rule of thirds, which should make it a more interesting shot. So now that we have our basic tonality set for our photo and we've kind of set our color point, now what we can do is we can deal with the other areas in our photo by just using local adjustments. So if you're not familiar with local adjustments are a great way that you can sort of paint on light or detail or colors or kind of anything you want to do to your photo. And they're all done locally, and they're all non-destructible, which every edit you do inside of Photo RAW is non-destructible anyway. But local adjustments are a great way to sort of selectively apply edits to your shots. For example, if I want to darken this area in the reflection, all I need to do is I've added a local adjustment layer. I'm just going to make sure it's set to darken. And now what I can do is, with either my local adjustment brush or my local adjustment gradient, in this case, I'm just going to use my local adjustment gradient because I can drop it down and then I can flip it and it'll darken that area on the reflection. And within local adjustment gradients, you have this little perforated line right here, which is the feathering on your local adjustment gradient. This little smaller bubble is how you rotate your gradient. So if you want to rotate it, and then this bigger bubble is how you move the gradient around on your photo. So for this particular shot, I just want it to be applied to the reflection in the water. So I'll just lower that feather quite a bit. Oops. So that feather's just kind of starting out where the horizon line is. And then all I'm going to do is, in local adjustments, you can either pull up on the exposure to make it less, but what I like to do is I'll just head over to my opacity and I'll just pull it down a little bit, just so that it blends better with the actual photo. And now if we hit the, to turn this on and off, it does a great job of kind of subduing this area on our shot and making it a little less distracting. Because whenever it comes to reflections, remember that the reflection is always going to be darker than the subject or the actual shot. So whatever's on the water is going to be darker. If you have a reflection that's incredibly bright, it's going to look unnatural. So local adjustments are a great way to kind of subdue reflections in the water and kind of lead viewers' eyes into the subject here. So now that we have kind of our local adjustment for the reflection, another great thing inside of local adjustments is you can just paint light. So what I like to do, especially with mountains, is I'll just add a local adjustment layer. I'll select lighten, And now what I can do is I'll go up to my local adjustment brush, which is K on your keyboard. You can grab that. And if you want to decrease the brush size, all you have to do is hit the bracket keys on your keyboard. So left bracket key will decrease it, right bracket key will increase it. And you can just decrease your brush size. And whenever I'm painting local adjustments, I never really worry about the opacity of the feathering, because I just kind of head over to the opacity inside the local adjustment layer and adjust after. So to give you an example, I'm just going to brush some nice light onto my mountain here. And I know it's going to look incredibly intense. Don't worry, we're going to pull back on it. So there we go. It looks insane and it doesn't look very natural. But the great thing about all these local adjustment layers and any filter that you add inside of effects is that you have the power to go back and adjust the opacity of that effect or layer. So you can simply just head over to your opacity layer or your opacity slider and then just pull it back. I like to pull it back to just a 0 and then incrementally kind of just pull up. And you can kind of just add light as you please. So there we go. Now if we turn this on and off, it's actually looking a little too intense, so we'll just pull it back again to about half that. So there we go. We've kind of brightened that up and given it a little bit more life. And now if if you've added any of these local adjustment layers, another thing you can do is you can readjust any of the settings in here. So say you wanted to heat up this mountain a little bit, because if you do apply a local adjustment layer and you do anything with lighten or you're boosting up the exposure, more often than not, you're going to lose a little bit of that color in there. So you'll notice that if I turn this all the way up and I zoom in here, oops, you'll notice that we're losing quite a bit of that color on our mountain. So if we go back and turn our opacity back down to about 25-ish, now what we can do is we can just increase the color temperature a little bit to bring back some of that color back into our mountain. So there we go. Now we have a little bit more light given to our subject, which is the mountain. And we also have given some of that color back into it when we added the exposure. Another great tool, if you're looking to use local adjustments, is to grab a local adjustment layer. And if you grab a local adjustment layer, it's going to apply it and it's automatically going to be set to darken. So you'll notice that if I close out of this and I add this layer, the exposure is set to -1. Well, it's always going to be set to -1. That's kind of the default. But there's these awesome preset styles up here that you can add onto your shot. And a great one that I like to add, it's called Magic Eye Fixer, but you can use it for anything. And it ups the exposure and it ups the structure and it adds a little contrast. And what you can do is, if you're kind of the same thing I was doing earlier, is you can do that. You can use this preset style, that preset style of Magic Eye Fixer, and you can paint it onto like mountains and stuff, or anything that really needs just kind of life added into it. Because it's going to bring in some detail, it's going to bring in some contrast, and it's going to bring in some light. So it's great for mountains or eyes or kind of really anything that you want to just kind of liven up. And then like we did earlier, is we can just head back into the opacity, turn it down a bunch, and then we can just boost up our color temperature. And now we've added a little bit of life into our mountain here. Are there any questions so far, Mo?
Hey, no questions right now. Keep going on. You're doing great.
Awesome. Thanks, man. All right. So that's just one example of how to kind of liven up a photo real quick. So if I hit the / key on my keyboard, oops. We did that in 3 sliders inside of develop, and then we added 2 local adjustment layers. So it really doesn't take much inside of Photo RAW to really bring your photo to life. And then if you do have a photo like this where there is a little bit of noise, I know with long exposures it's kind of hard because you have to up the ISO a ton. But no fear, you can always just head into either develop inside of overall settings and go down to your details right here. And this is where you can fix any noise that you see in your shot. So for example, if I zoom in here, you'll notice that there's quite a bit of noise in this cloud and then these shadows. So what you can do is just head down to your noise reduction and just kind of play with your luminance. You'll see how if I pulled up on that luminance, it really pulled the noise away from that cloud here. And then if you want to add, or then if you want to use it onto the color, so if you have these colorful areas down in the reflection, you can always just pull up on the color denoiser as well. And then also, to take denoising even further, I'm just going to reset that. You can head into effects and add a filter, and then there's a noise reduction filter already prepared for you inside of effects. So that's one example of how to edit a landscape photo. If it's a little overexposed or underexposed, for example, this photo was a little underexposed, definitely play with your midtones and your shadows, because that's kind of going to bring up those darker areas in your shot. Definitely your shadows. ON1 Photo RAW has an incredibly powerful shadow slider. So if you do end up in a situation like this where your photo is a little dark, I wouldn't worry, because you can always pull up on your shadows. And then if it does pull out a little bit of noise, you can always go in and you use some noise reduction. And a little graininess never hurt anybody anyway. So if you do have some noise in here and you don't like the way the noise reduction is working, or it looks a little too glow-like, I wouldn't even worry about it, because most of the time people aren't even going to notice, and the photo is going to look great regardless. So, all right, so that's for kind of an underexposed photo. Now let's grab kind of an overexposed shot here, and we'll do this one. And this photo is quite bright, and another great thing about ON1 Photo RAW is that the power of the shadow slider really helps to allow you to pull back on your exposure to reveal details like within the sky or the clouds. So you'll notice that if I go into tone of color here, and I have these super incredibly bright clouds, which I'm sure you guys, if you've gone out and shot some landscapes, you've noticed that it's kind of hard to expose for everything in a scene like this, especially when you have these incredibly bright white clouds. But if you get a situation like this, I would try to expose it. If you look at my levels here, you'll notice that it's a little overexposed. It's a little too bright, but I wanted the detail in this rock, and I didn't want to really have to pull out any of the shadows within it. And I did that because I knew that ON1 Photo RAW, if you pull back on the exposure and you pull up on the shadows, you can get a nicely exposed shot. So if I hold down the J key on my keyboard, it's going to show me my clipping warnings. So if I hold down the J key, you'll notice that I have red clipping warnings up in the top where my sky is, and that's just showing me my true white without any detail. So all of these reds in here are just showing me all of my true white clipping warnings without any detail in my shot. And if I were to pull back on it and it shows some blue in here, that's just showing my true black. So to get rid of this, I'll just continue holding down my J key, and I'll just pull back on my exposure slider. And you'll notice right away that it's bringing back in so much awesome detail into these clouds here. If we go back, I mean, it's just night and day difference between the details in the clouds and then when I pulled it back. So we'll pull back our exposure to about where we want it. I'd say almost 1.5 stops back. So we have some nice detail in these clouds here. And then like I did earlier, is you can just head down to your shadow slider, and you can just simply pull up on your shadows, and it'll reveal those darker areas. And now you're left with awesome clouds and an evenly exposed landscape. So a great tip, if you ever come across that when you're shooting landscapes, is to definitely think about how you're going to edit that. ON1 Photo RAW has an amazing way to recover shadow details and also to tone back any bright areas in your shot. So if you have some clouds like that, hold down the J key, see where your white clipping warnings are, pull them back a little bit, and then you can just reveal the shadows. Okay, so now we have kind of a basic tonality set for our shot. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to crop this a little bit. And we're going to kind of do the same thing we did before. We're kind of going to use this line as our guide. And we're just going to pull back. I'm going to hold down Shift and pull back on my crop here. And the main thing I want to do is I kind of wanted to get rid of those people over there. And then I kind of wanted to just tighten up the frame here. So I'll just pull this in. Move this over a little bit. And now we kind of have this point around where our subject is, and then we have this other point where our foreground kind of begins. So we have this little frame here, kind of framing this corner, and then it's leading, this little line here is leading our eye right here into Haystack Rock on Cannon Beach. So a good thing to think about whenever you're exposing, or I mean, not exposing, whenever you're trying to compose a shot, is to think about leading lines. It's really easy in landscapes to use hills and foliage or whatever it may be, logs to your advantage, so that you can kind of have this vessel that kind of carries viewers' eyes into whatever subject you want. In this case, it's haystack rock, and so we have this nice little line leading into it. It's nice and blurred out, so it adds a little bit of depth to the photo. So I'll just hit enter, and now we have kind of a nicely cropped photo, and we can start adding different adjustments to it. So now that we've kind of adjusted for our sky here and then pulled out the shadow tones, it's looking a little bit flat, but that's not a big deal, because just like we did earlier, we can play with our midtones and our contrast and give it a little bit more life. So I'm just going to pull up on the contrast a little bit, and then I'm going to pull up on the midtones a little bit. And now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, you'll see that basically the only thing that kind of changes is the sky. And before, we didn't really want to deal with any of the other tones in our shot other than the sky. So that's exactly what we wanted. We just wanted to get kind of some of those details back into the sky without affecting the overall exposure of our subject in our foreground. So now that we've kind of have those adjustments set, now what we can do is if you're playing with the white and black clipping warnings, say you're holding down the J key to see the red, to see your true white, what I would do is to play with your true black in your photo. So this black slider is going to allow you to play with your true black in your shot. And true black is a great way to add in contrast if this contrast slider isn't really doing it for you. So again, what you want to do is hold down on your J key, and then you can pull back on your black slider. Actually quite a bit. We'll pull it about right there. And you'll see that it gives it a nice little bit of contrast, especially in this area down here, and kind of gives it a little bit more detail, kind of makes the photo pop. And then the next thing I'm going to do is there's this kind of, I don't know, weird overcast color on our shot here. And the way to deal with that is, if you're not sure if you need to heat up the photo or you need to cool the photo down, is to just play with your temperature slider, because you can always, so say I move this slider too far over here or too far over here, all you have to do to reset it is just double click it. So if you're scared to play with a slider because you're not sure what it does, or you don't want to mess up the adjustment, just play with it, because you can always just mess with it, mess it up, and then double click the title and it'll go back to its default setting. So don't be scared to play with any slider, because it's incredibly easy to reset and go back. So the best way to learn on how to edit these photos is to definitely just play with the sliders. So now that so I'll go back and I'll heat this photo up a little bit just to bring back some of the colors within this, the beach area here, and then within the sky over here. So now that we have a little bit more kind of yellowy color, and it looks more like a sunset, which it was. So now we have kind of our basic tonality set for our shot. Now what we can do is, I know a ton of you guys, I'm sure, have shot photos, at a beach or somewhere where there's a bunch of people, and you're like, wow, I don't want these people in the shot, but I really want to get the shot. So what you can do is you can take the shot with all those people in there, and the great thing about ON1 Photo RAW is that it has all of the retouching tools available to you inside of Develop and Effects. So if you do have these people in here and you want to remove them, you can simply go to your retouching tools over here, which you have your magic eraser or your perfect eraser, and then you have your clone stamp tool. What I usually like to do is, before I grab my clone stamp tool, because the clone stamp tool is kind of a manual way to remove people or objects, whereas the perfect eraser kind of does it for you, is I like to grab my perfect eraser just to see if it can do it for me. And if it doesn't, you can always just reset it and go back to your clone stamp tool. But if it does do the work for you, it's incredibly, it makes your life a lot easier, because you don't have to go and clone stamp all of these people out. So we'll just go in here and I'll try to remove some of these people here. Okay, I don't think it's going to work on these people because there's a bit of different layers of tonality. So we'll just grab our clone stamp tool here. And if you aren't familiar with the clone stamp tool is kind of your your mandatory all access object removal tool for your photo. So it's all manual. You have to do it yourself. It's not going to automatically detect where things need to clean out. It's not going to use any content aware technology like the Perfect Eraser does. So it's kind of all up to you. But a good way to do it, especially if you're doing it on a beach, is to lower your brush size a little bit, kind of to what size you have the object you want to remove. And then use lines in your photo. For example, these lines on the beach here. Use these lines to your advantage. So the way the clone stamp tool works is you hold down your Option key, and then you set a point. So for example, this is going to be the point that I clone. This is my anchor point. So now you'll notice that if I hover over these people, there's a little bit of that point on them because I have my feathering at 100 and my opacity at 100, so it's covering up these people. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab that point again, and I'm just going to brush it on. And now we remove those people from our scene. There's a little bit of this, there's a little bit of a halo of this guy in here. Boom. So there we go. And now to remove these people, we'll do the same exact thing. Ooh, that's bad. We're not going to do that one. I made it too small. Okay, so there we go. Now we've removed all of the people from our scene here. If we zoom out, now we have nobody in our scene, and it looks a lot better with nobody in there. So a good rule of thumb, if you're trying to remove people from a scene, especially in a landscape, is to try your Perfect Eraser first, just to see if it does the work for you, because if it does, it's going to save you a ton of time later. But if it doesn't, and you do need to use the clone stamp tool, just keep in mind that you're going to want to set an anchor point that's kind of similar to wherever you're trying to stamp out, and then also try to really make the anchor point about, or not the anchor point, make the brush size about the same size as you would want the object to be removed. For example, when I was removing that one person, it was a little too small, and then it wasn't coming out as natural. So just be careful with that. It does take some time to kind of perfect it and practice it. A good thing to do is just to be, a good thing to do would be to just to play with it and kind of see how it goes from there. Do we have any questions so far, Mo?
No, there's no questions right now. So just as a reminder to everyone, there is a Q&A module there. There's a few questions that I'm helping out answering here. But if there's anything you want Dylan to show over or that you want him to cover, feel free to throw that into the Q&A module, and we can easily show you that again.
Awesome. Thanks, Mo. So yeah, so we'll head on to effects here. And like I said, there's just a bunch of, I kind of just grabbed a bunch of different random photos that kind of had different styles to them that we can kind of play with. So we'll take this photo for a minute into effects, and I'll show you guys a few different filters that I like to add onto photos like this. The first filter I'd probably want to add onto this shot is I'll add a filter, and one of my favorite filters to add onto landscape photos is definitely sunshine. And sunshine's an awesome filter because it brightens the brighter areas in your shot and darkens the darker areas. And you'll see that if I add this sunshine filter, it's kind of a little bit too strong in the sky area here. But I like what it's doing on this area kind of by the sand. And then I like what it's doing to the area on my rock. So what you can do is you can just simply invert this. And now it's not applied to any of the sky areas. And then you'll notice that you have your masking brush selected already, but it's set to paint out. Pro tip, if you're trying to switch it from paint out to paint in, just hold down Shift and hit X on your keyboard, and you'll notice that it switches it right away. So Shift X to switch from paint in to paint out, and bracket keys again to increase the brush size. And now you can just brush in that sunshine filter onto the area on your beach without it being applied to any of your sky. Boom. So we have a little part over here. So now if we turn that on and off, it's really kind of given it like a nice boost. It's emulated that sunshine look and kind of given a little bit more pop, especially on the rock here. And my next favorite filter that I like to add onto landscapes especially is I like to add dynamic contrast. I'm sure you guys, if you've played with Photo RAW, know what dynamic contrast is. It's an amazing, amazing filter to add onto your shots. It basically just, you deal with the contrast and the detail within your photo. There's a bunch of different settings in here that you can apply. I usually like to stick with natural or soft. In this example, I'm going to stick with natural, but I'm going to pull down my large back to 0. And I'm just going to boost the small up a little bit, about 15 probably. And the reason I'm doing small and medium is because you'll notice that the area on this rock here is a lot of smaller areas of contrast, and then the areas in here is a lot of medium areas of contrast. Whereas the large might deal with like large areas of tonal contrast, maybe up in here with these larger areas of different tonalities. But for now, we're dealing with the smaller areas of micro contrast. So we'll boost up the small, leave the medium at 15. And then the same thing we did with the sunshine is we'll go to our masking options. We'll invert the mask, and now we'll just do the same thing like we did before, except I'm going to head up to my, I'm going to head up to my perfect brush, and I'm going to make sure that's selected. And the reason I like to select that is because if you're dealing with dynamic contrast, especially if you're trying to make your subject pop with detail, but you don't want any of the other background areas to have detail, especially with clouds. I'm not a huge fan of clouds having that crunchy detail. So you can turn your perfect brush on so that it kind of separates the tonalities, and then it'll allow you to brush on the dynamic contrast onto the subject here without getting any on your foreground. So to show you what that does is I'll just simply brush this on to my rock here. And then I'll brush it over here. I probably don't need to brush it onto the blurry part, but I'm already there. So I wouldn't brush it onto the blurry part if I were you, but it doesn't really matter at this point. I'm just kind of showing you guys how to brush it on. And now if I view my mask, oops. What? Huh. Oops. Anyway, so if I view my mask, sorry guys. Well, anyway, so if I view my mask here, you'll notice that the red area is showing where that mask isn't applied to. So you'll see that it's not even being applied to any of these areas within the sky here. And it's basically only being applied to this area on my rock and applied to this area on the sandy hillside. So that's exactly what we want. And now what you can do is you can go back and you can brush it in to kind of refine it a little bit more. You don't have to be too specific. People aren't going to be looking out for that much detail in your photo, but I know that if you are kind of a perfectionist, it's kind of the way to do it. So now that we have that mask applied to our photo, you'll notice that if we turn this on and off, I'll zoom in here for you guys so you can see it better. See how that's giving that area of our rock just a ton more detail? And then another great filter I like to add, I'll zoom out here. Another great filter I like to add onto these shots, especially landscape shots, is I'll add a tone enhancer. And I'll go in here and I'll head down to curves. And I kind of like to do this with a lot of my photos. I've been doing this with pretty much every photo lately. And it kind of just seems like a great way to kind of liven up your shot a little bit. And with this photo, it might not work out because we've kind of pulled back our exposure into the clouds. But if you do have a photo and it's just kind of lacking on life and it looks a little flat and you don't know what to do with it, a great way to kind of bring in a little bit of pop is to head down to, go into tone enhancer, head down to your curves, which is basically your tone curve. And this area is going to be your shadows and your complete blacks down here. This area is going to be your midtones, and then you're going to have your highlights. So what I like to do is I'll just pull up on my midtones here quite a bit, and then I'll just pull back on my shadow slider, and you'll notice that it kind of brings in a little bit of pop and a little bit of detail. And then you can also just go back up and pull back, on your exposure to give it a little bit more detail in those clouds. So if I turn this on and off, it's a good way to just kind of bring in a little bit of life into your photo. And then another way to enhance your sky a little bit is if you're looking to give it a little bit more color, it's looking a little bland, is you can simply go to color enhancer and you can click sky. And you'll notice that it didn't do a whole lot right there because there's not a whole lot of blue in our sky. But if I turn this on and off, it's giving this area in our sky quite a bit of nice little light blue and kind of darker blue in here. And you'll notice that if I turn this on and off, it's bringing in a lot of blue into this area right there. So what I can do is you'll remember that I painted on this dynamic contrast and I painted it everywhere but the sky. So what we can do is we can copy this, head into our color enhancer, and then we can paste that mask, and then we can invert it. And now if we view it, the mask is only being applied to the sky area up here, and it's not being applied to our rock or the hillside where the sand is. So there we go. So now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, you'll see we really kind of livened up this photo with only using a few different effects and different filters. Are there any questions so far, Mo?
Hey, sorry about that. Couldn't find my mute. Couldn't find my mute button there. Yeah, no questions. So keep going. This webinar is being recorded. For those of you who are wondering, we'll have it posted today. Otherwise, keep on going, Dylan.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Okay, so a question just popped up here from Matthew saying, I realize the brushing and development are a bit hasty due to time constraints. How long do you spend editing an image outside of webinars? Do you utilize the perfect brush? And I'd say I probably spend the same amount of time editing photos in the webinar as I do outside of them, because when it comes to photography, I try to take like an honest photo unless I'm really getting creative with the filters and effects in it. And the reason I love Photo RAW is that you can just simply add a filter, add as many filters as you want, and you can create a unique look in seconds. So, but however, when it comes to retouching, I probably would spend a lot more time retouching a photo outside of the webinar, just because retouching, if you do mess it up, it does look incredibly janky and incredibly unnatural. So I wouldn't worry about spending too much time with editing your photos if you do take like an awesome shot or you have out of the camera great photo. But when it comes to retouching, I would probably spend a lot more time with it, just because it's a great tool to have in your arsenal. And if you do it right, it makes your photo look a lot better. So we'll move on here and we'll go back. And again, I just have, a few photos that I have that I thought I could show you guys some different tips and tricks with. So we'll grab this one and This is just a Milky Way photo I shot near Mount Hood a few weeks ago. And the reason I'm doing this one is because A, it's an Astro shot and they're super fun to edit. But B is that I shot it with, I can't remember what body I used, but it came out incredibly noisy. So this would be a good one as another example for noise reduction. So whenever it comes to Astro shots, I typically like to crop first. And I like to crop first because there's not a whole lot of interesting stuff going on in this area over here, or this area up top, or over here. So just grab the crop tool again. And just like we were doing before, we're going to kind of use these rule of third lines to guide us in our crop. So I'll hold down the shift key here, pull it down, and I'll just bring it down until I have probably the Milky Way. I can kind of put the Milky Way on sort of this area of the rule of thirds, and then I can kind of bring the mountain here closer to this. So yeah, so that looks like a decent crop. Hit enter, and now we have kind of a nicely cropped photo. And whenever you're dealing with stuff like this, kind of like in that earlier example when I shot over Lake Trillium and you had the reflection, is that with long exposure photos, you're gonna wanna pull out some of the life in the shot, but you're not gonna wanna overpower it to where you can't see any of these stars. So what I mean by that is you wanna bring in some exposure or some sort of mid-tone boost or shadow boost, but you don't wanna overdo it. So overdoing it would be like doing that, where you can't even see any more of the Milky Way, it's all blown out. So what I would do is deal with your shadows a little bit first, and then maybe your mid-tones. But you'll notice that right away, if you pull up your shadows and your mid-tones, you're kind of pulling out a lot of that detail in the Milky Way. So what you can do is after you pull up on your shadows and mid-tones and maybe your highlights a little bit and your whites, because you do have some whites in the frame, you have these whites in the stars, is you can play with your contrast now and your black slider. So now if I pull up on the contrast here, you'll see that it's bringing a lot more of that detail back into my Milky Way without kind of removing some of that exposure we already brought in. You can also go down to your blacks and pull that back a little bit. And you don't have to do this all at the same time. You can kind of play with your midtones and your shadows, pull down on your blacks, pull back on your midtones. So it's kind of all about just kind of finding that perfect balance when it comes to tonality, especially with astrophotography. So now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, it's looking a little better. There's still some stuff we can do to it. And what I want to do is I'm just going to pull up on my temperature a little bit. Probably right about there, just to bring back some of those nice colors in our Milky Way here. And we already have some blue cast over here, so we're probably good with the color. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to head down to these details here, and I'm just going to go to my noise reduction, and I'm just going to pull up on it quite a bit. Probably about there. So we have a little bit of noise reduction in our shot. Maybe even a little less, probably about 11. A little bit goes a long way with noise reduction sometimes, so be aware. And now what we can do is we can head into effects. And when it comes to filters inside of effects, I do this every time, but I always add the sunshine filter. But I love the sunshine filter so much. I think it really brings out a lot of life inside of shots that normally you wouldn't be able to get. So with astrophotography, especially if you're shooting like the Milky Way or shooting stars or something at night, the sunshine filter is going to be awesome because it's going to bring out the brighter areas in your photo, and then it's going to subdue the darker tones. So that's kind of exactly what we want with this Milky Way, is we want these brighter areas of the Milky Way to come to life, but we don't want to, bring out too much of it to where we can't see any of the details. So what we can do is we can add a filter, and we can add sunshine. And you'll notice right away that does an awesome job of kind of bringing out these details in our Milky Way and kind of subduing the areas around it that are a little bit darker. You can also play with the different presets in here. I normally like to keep it at natural. It's kind of my favorite preset with pretty much every filter that has the natural setting. Just seems a little bit more relaxed, and it doesn't seem as edited. But there are some great preset styles in here. I know the, what is it? The glow one's a great one, especially if you have reflections. It's a little too bright for this one, but if you do click the glow one, you can always pull down the amount or play with the warmth and saturation. So you do always have those different controls that you can adjust. I typically like to stick with natural, and that looks pretty good for our shot here. The next filter I like to add, if I'm ever dealing with, astrophotography like this, is I'll add a filter, and again, I'll add dynamic contrast. And this time I'll just go down to the preset style and I'll go to texture enhancer, and then I'll pull it back a ton. And then just pull it up incrementally until you get what you want. So now if I hit this on and off, probably needs a little bit more. So there we go. Now we have a little bit of detail added into our Milky Way here. And I don't want it to be applied to this area around it, so I can just go to my masking options. I'll invert it, Shift X to switch to paint in, and then I'll just brush it on where my Milky Way is. So now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, we've kind of added a lot of life to this photo, and we only really did it in a couple sliders and 2 different filters. So we'll go back here and we'll do maybe 1 or 2 more photos here. It's kind of getting to about that time. And we'll do the sunset one. We haven't done a sunset one yet. So sunset photos are a great photo to edit. They're probably one of the most fun photos to edit. The reason I like this one is because it kind of had this light coming on this rock here, and it kind of led my eye into the sunset. So if you have a sunset photo, especially a photo that's like this and you have a lot of color in the clouds and a lot of color in the water, you're gonna probably want to deal with the saturation somehow. And especially with this shot, it's a little too orange, and well, not a little too orange, it's pretty red, but that's kind of how it looked. So what you can do is you can just go to your temperature and you can either cool it down a little bit, because I do want to bring back some of the blue up here, and we can always paint in different colors within our sky. So I guess speaking more to that, if you guys are worried about how to start out with your photo, or how do I begin an edit, or what do I do to edit my shot, what I would do is just try to play with these basic tone and color sliders, like your exposure and your midtones and your shadows, and then head down to your temperature and your saturation just to see like what colors you want in your shot. Because you can always go back and readjust them later, so I wouldn't worry too much about getting that initial tonality set right away. So if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, you'll see just by adding that little bit of blue, it brought some blue back into our sky here. And so now what we can do is I'm just going to hold down my J key again to see if I have any true white or true black. And I have some true black in my photo, which is completely fine. And so it looks like most of the photo is pretty well exposed. So we'll just head to our shadows. And now we'll pull back on the exposure a little bit. Then we'll add a little bit of contrast. And we'll add a little bit more true black. And then a little bit less saturation. So there we go. It's a little more exposed, and we can always bring back saturation into the sky if we want to, which we can do later. But for now, I'm just going to go over to my crop tool here, and we're just going to crop this. And I'm going to crop it so that I have sort of this leading line going into the middle. And I'm going to use my leveling tool. To level a photo, just simply click the leveling tool here, and then you can just drag it across a horizon line. Boom, and it'll level your photo instantly. So we'll probably keep the sun right in the middle, have this little line in the middle, hit enter, and now we have this nice sunset pic. So the first thing I'm going to do, besides the overall settings inside of tone and color, or inside of develop using tone and color, is I'm going to add a local adjustment layer. I'm going to make sure it's set to lighten. I'm going to boost up the shadows quite a bit, and then I'm going to add quite a bit of structure so that it gives some detail. And then I'm just going to paint it in. And then I'm going to go back And I'm going to pull back on the opacity. And then I'm just going to incrementally. So there we go. Now we kind of have that area that kind of leads the viewer's eye into the sunset there. And now what we can do is we can add another local adjustment layer, and we'll lighten it again, but we'll pull this back to about, I don't know, 0.7, a little bit of the shadows, and then we'll use our local adjustment gradient. We'll drop it down. Then we can just flip this around and we'll pull the feathering down. And then we can do the same thing we did before and just play with the opacity to pull back some of those more details in here so that we have a nice little foreground in here and a nice background. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm not going to add a local adjustment layer. I'm going to head into effects. And I'm going to add, again, the sunshine filter. And you'll see right away that by adding that sunshine filter, it took our photo to the next level pretty much in one filter. So if I hit turn this on and off, you'll see that we kept some of that light in here from what we painted in. Because if we went to local adjustments and we turn this off, you'll see it's not as lit up. There's no exposure there, and the water looks dark. Whereas if we painted in those minor local adjustment layers, it kind of elevated our photo and allowed us to have a nice foreground and also have a nice background. A great tool also, if you're looking to kind of lead the viewer's eye into something like this, is to add a filter, add dynamic contrast, and then go into your masking options, invert it, go down to your tone, and then up your shadows, and then up your vibrance. And now hold down Shift and X to go back to paint in, and now you can just paint in nice dynamic contrast onto your foreground, all while keeping the shadows and vibrance up so that you're not removing any of that exposure or adding in micro contrast that will make your photo more dark. And the same thing again, you can just go to your opacity, pull it back to 0, and then kind of just incrementally pull it up to how you please. So now if I turn that on and off, it does a great job of kind of livening up that foreground area for us. And the last filter you could add onto a photo like this, I usually like to add maybe a vignette sometimes. I'll usually just go to Big Softy. And there we go. I can probably pull back on the opacity again. And now if I turn this on and off, we have this nice sunshine photo, and we didn't really do a whole lot to it. We kind of just pulled up on the shadows, added a couple filters, and yeah, so if I hit the \K on my keyboard, just kind of liven up the photo just by using a couple different adjustments to it. Do we have any other questions, Mo?
No questions right now. Yeah, so just to remind everyone, this is being recorded. We'll have this posted up on the website today if you want to go back and watch anything.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, let's do one quick photo here. It's been about an hour, so we'll do one more photo, and then I can leave you guys to start playing with Photo RAW. So we'll actually go to this one. And this is going to be a good photo. I'm going to show you guys a little bit on how to paint light using local adjustments. So if we head into Develop, and the first thing I want to do to this shot is I'm just going to crop it. So again, hold down the Shift key, pull it in, get a nice crop. And you can grab your leveling tool. The leveling tool, it doesn't need to be inside the crop range. So if you are looking to use a horizontal line, or horizontal line that's outside the crop range, you can do that as well. There we go. We have our photo cropped now. I'm just going to hit Enter. And so we have this photo, and we have the mountain here, and then these clouds kind of going over the crown of it. What I want to do is I want to deal with sort of more of the detail in this mountain here and less about what's in the clouds. So basically what I'm going to do as far as the tone and color goes is all I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up on the contrast, pull up on my midtones, and then pull back, excuse me, on my black sliders. So I'm just going to hold down the J key on my keyboard. So there we go. That's all I'm going to do inside of as far as the tonality goes. And then I'm just going to head down to my temperature here, and I'm just going to heat the photo up a little bit to kind of remove some of that blue cast. So there we go. If I hit the backslash key on my keyboard now, it's kind of got more of an airy feel to it. It's a little less blue. So now we have our tonality set. Let's head into local adjustments. And the first thing I want to do is I want to add contrast. And how to add contrast using local adjustments is you want to use a darken layer or a lighten layer. And all you're going to do is just make sure it's set to darken. Make sure your brush size is kind of appropriate. And then you can just, what I do is I just brush on this darken local adjustment layer onto the darker areas on the mountain here. And you don't have to be exact. You're going to pull back on this quite a bit, but it's a great way to bring in contrast to your photo without having to actually make sure the cloud's hovering over at the right time. So we'll just paint a little bit more here. And again, all I'm doing is just kind of painting around where the shadows are. And you'll see what I'm doing in a second. It's not going to look so great right now, but it'll look good in a minute. And again, I'm not being incredibly exact. I honestly probably wouldn't be too exact in real life either, but definitely for the webinar, I'm not being that exact. Okay, so now we have just like we'll paint more here. A couple areas that have, you know, a little bit of shadowy detail, and we kind of painted over them. So now what we can do is just head over to our adjustment here and turn down the opacity again. And then just kind of pull up on it again, incrementally. So now if I turn that on and off, it added a lot of nice contrast onto our mountain here. And then we can do the exact same thing, but we can add a lighten layer. So we'll add a local adjustment layer, set it to lighten. And again, we'll just paint in the brighter areas on our mountain. Okay, so same thing, go back to your local adjustment layer, turn down the opacity, and then turn it up incrementally. So now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, you'll see that in this mountain area here, we really added a lot of nice. Oh, we're gonna pull up on this more. There we go. Okay, so that's kind of how to paint light onto your landscape area. It's great for if you have, it's great if you have overcast clouds that are kind of, you have the sun that's peeking through and adding different contrast onto your landscape layer, and you want to just bring in a little bit more contrast and a little bit more life to your shot. The next thing I would do onto this photo is I'd probably go into effects, I'd add a filter, and I'd probably add dynamic contrast. And I would do the same thing we've been doing, is I would invert the mask, and then I would just Shift X and just paint it in to the mountain here. So we turn that on and off. It's doing a great job of bringing in some of that detail into our mountain. And another cool thing, if you do have clouds like this that are a little bit darker, I think they were just like some nice storm clouds, is if you want to add like a dramatic look onto your photo, is you can head into your local adjustments, you can add another layer, and you can add a darken layer, and you can drop that darken layer just right on top of your clouds. And we'll bring up the feathering quite a bit. And you'll notice that if I turn this on and off, it's really bringing in some dramatic feels to the clouds up here. And you can always just pull back the opacity like we were doing earlier and make it more natural. And so the last thing I'd probably do to this photo is I'd add a filter. And again, I'd probably just add sunshine. There we go. And now if I hit the backslash key on my keyboard, we have this nice kind of dramatic scene here where we've dealt with the different contrasts in the mountain, we've dealt with the clouds here, and then we've added some detail. So are there any last questions, Mo, before we finish up here?
No, you're good. There are no questions.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, again, thank you so much for joining me. Those were just kind of some tips and tricks on how to edit your photos using ON1 Photo RAW. Again, this webinar is being recorded, so if you did miss out on anything, we're all going to be posting it to our YouTube, our blog, and our Facebook later today. So feel free to catch up on there. And again, thanks so much for joining me. I'm Dylan with ON1, and have a great day.